Hi there, this is Eric for Ochoy. In this video, we're going to take a look at working with the Toon material in Octane for Maya. And for this video, I'm using the spacepilot_toon.ma scene, which you can open up and check out and see how the Toon materials work. They're pretty easy overall, and they create a very nice, non-photorealistic, stylistic look to your scenes. So everything in this scene is using a Toon material with the exception of the shield on the helmet, which has a specular material, and the eyes, which have a diffuse material with a little bit of emission added to it, just to make them look nice and creepy. But everything else is a Toon material applied to it. When you're working with the Toon material, probably the first thing you want to do is add a Toon light to the scene. This ensures that the shadows render correctly and that the light interacts with the materials well. As you can see, I have a Toon directional light in the scene. If I select it and hide it, you can see everything becomes kind of flat. It's a neat look, but not quite as interesting as the one we're trying to achieve here. So I'm going to, actually, let's leave that hidden for a second, and I'm going to add a new Toon light to the scene. So if I go to the OctaneRender tab, I have two different Toon lights here. I have a point light and a directional light. Let's add a point light. So click it to add a point light. Let's select the point light and move it in the scene so we can see that it is casting shadows in the scene, as well as shading the surfaces to give them kind of a look of a highlight here. So that's the point light. I'm going to hide that for a second. And let's unhide the directional light here, the Toon directional light. And with the Toon directional light, if I select it and go into the attribute editor, you can see I have a size and viewport here. So if I increase the size and viewport, it's a little bit easier to see. It doesn't affect the light, just makes it easier to see while you're working in the scene. And you also have two different modes here. So let's move this over here. You can see it's not really, the placement of the light doesn't have a whole lot of effect on the shadows, but I have two options here. Let's make the size and viewport just a little bit smaller. That works. So I can set this to daylight system, so it has its own daylight system controls down here, which controls the longitude and latitude, which is essentially the direction of the light, as well as the hour and other aspects, just kind of like the regular daylight system settings. And I can also set this to directional, which makes it more of like a directional light, and then if I rotate the light, I can change the position of the shadows. You also see that the shadows can have a slightly different quality to them, as well as the highlights on the space pilot here. So that's the basics of working with the Toon lights. Let's set this back to daylight system. And just going to rotate this around so we can see what's going on here on the space pilot himself. Let's zoom in here real quick. So let's take a closer look at the Toon material itself. I'm going to select the torso here of our space pilot, and in the OctaneRender shelf, I'm going to click on this button right here that applies a new Toon material. Of course, you can also go to the Octane menu or create it directly from within Hypershade. Doesn't matter as long as it's applied to the surface. I'm going to open it up in the attribute editor here and press the select button so we can kind of see the result. So since we already added our Toon lights to the scene, let's take a look at that aspect of the material. If you go into the attribute editor for the Toon material, you'll see under lighting mode you have Toon lights or camera light. So camera light bases the lighting on the camera direction. So you can see these highlights are kind of perpendicular to the camera direction. And Toon lights means the lighting comes from any and all of the Toon lights that have been added to the scene. So a lot of the attributes you'll see here look somewhat familiar. We have our diffuse, so I can always add a color to the diffuse channel, a nice bright green there, or I could add a texture. Same with the specular, have the specular intensity, I can add a texture or just use a float value, and then the roughness controls the spread of the highlight across the surface. Now, in addition to these kind of standard settings, you also have the ability to use ramps to kind of fine-tune the look of the diffuse and specular qualities of the surface. So if I click on this checker box here next to diffuse ramp, I'll open up the create render node window, and under Octane textures I'm going to find the Octane Toon ramp texture and click on it. Now this ramp texture, the way this works is that we can add colors to the ramp by clicking on the add new item button. So let's click on this a couple times. And we can also control the interpolation of the ramp using this menu. I find it's a lot easier to see what's going on if I set this to linear. So I'll set that to linear, and then let's set this RGB color to white, and then change the position on the ramp. And now you can kind of start to see the effect as I move the position up and down, or if I move the position of the black up and down. At a certain point it's going to be higher on the ramp than the white, which is going to look kind of weird. But let's bring this down. Let's add another item here. So let's make this one white, bring it all the way towards the end, one end of the ramp here. Let's make this, I don't know, bright yellow. Move this a little bit higher so you can see how it's kind of affecting the look of the diffuse right here. And for the darker color, let's make this sort of a dark green, maybe something like that. So the ramps are there to help you stylize the look of the surface. And if we go back to the material, we'll see that we can also add a specular ramp, which works very similar to the diffuse ramp, but it just adjusts the, or helps you to fine tune and stylize the look of the specular highlight. So if I add a specular ramp here, I'll choose Octane Toon ramp texture. Let's add a couple items here. Let's set this to white. Sorry, position to 1, and let's set the color to white. Let's set this to linear. You can see there it is. And I can start to adjust the position on the darker color. I think if I add, let's add one more color here. Let's do, I don't know, yellow. There we go. Makes it a bit more obvious. And then I can adjust the position here. So you can see it kind of helps me to kind of play with the look of those highlights there. Very similar to the way the diffuse ramp looks. Now, of course, we can also add a texture to the diffuse and specular channels. So let's open up Hypershade. I'm going to select the pants here and choose Graph Materials and Selected Objects, just so I can see the textures here that are plugged into the pants. It's called Space Body Toon material. I'm going to select the torso here, go to its material, and then find that base color texture. Just middle mouse button drag it over the diffuse channel, and that's going to apply that texture to this material. Now, of course, it looks different from the pants here in terms of the colors because I've already adjusted by adding a diffuse ramp and a specular ramp, so they're kind of out of sync here. But you can see that's how textures are used in these materials. Likewise, for this material, I could middle mouse button drag the normal. So you can see the details become more prominent. And then, of course, we also have a roughness texture in here, which I can middle mouse button drag over here. I'm going to middle mouse button drag the Space Pilot Body Toon material on top of the torso here just to apply it. So it's all the material. And that way the body is all using the same Toon material. I'm going to select this material and then just take a quick look at the outline color and outline thickness settings. So outline thickness is fairly self-explanatory. As I raise this, the outlines and the edges here become thicker. The outlines are based on the facing ratio, so as the camera moves around and you can in the scene, you can see that outline adjust accordingly. And then, of course, we can change the color. So if we wanted to make this bright pink, maybe the poor guy's gone radioactive or something like that. Let's change it to something that's a little bit less of an eye irritant. Something like that. kind of weirdly stylized. Pretty self-explanatory. So that's the basics of working with the Toon material in Octane for Maya.